Stunting a child's growth by placing them in restrictive metal clothing like iron boots or hats isn't just a hypothetical cruelty, it's a profound violation of international human rights and biological necessity. When we talk about physical growth, we're talking about a process that relies on movement, flexibility, and proper nutrition, all of which are violently disrupted if a child is physically restrained in heavy, rigid gear.
It's interesting you bring up iron specifically because the biological reality of childhood bone development is that it's an active, responsive process. A child's skeleton isn't just a smaller version of an adult's, it's mostly cartilage that slowly ossifies or hardens over 2 decades. If you introduce a rigid external barrier like iron boots, you aren't just stopping growth, you're forcing the body to grow against a hard limit, which leads to severe deformities and permanent structural damage. The bones try to expand, but with nowhere to go, they thicken or twist in ways that cause lifelong pain.
And it goes beyond just the physical shape. There's the concept of mechanical loading. Studies published in journals like Pediatric Exercise Science show that children's bones actually need the stress of running and jumping to gain mineral density. By encasing a child in metal, you're removing that vital impact loading, which means their bones will be incredibly weak and porous, even if they manage to grow a little bit within those confines.
Exactly. And let's look at the legal framework because that's where the criminal aspect comes in. Under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, specifically Article 19, states are required to protect children from all forms of physical or mental violence, injury, or abuse. Subjecting a child to such extreme physical restriction would almost certainly fall under cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment as defined in Article 37. Legally, you're not just a growth stopper, you're a perpetrator of torture.
It's also worth noting that this kind of physical restraint would trigger a severe stress response. Research on child psychology highlights that mechanical restraint causes trauma that can interrupt brain development. The child isn't just physically trapped, their nervous system is shifted into a permanent state of survival mode. This causes long-term issues with sleep, learning, and the ability to form trusting relationships.
There's also the chemical risk that people often overlook. Real iron isn't just pure Fe. If these were manufactured items, they could contain heavy metals like lead or cadmium. Research from the London School of Economics has pointed out that even modern textiles for infants can sometimes exceed safety limits for heavy metals. If a child is in constant contact with industrial-grade metal, you have the risk of dermal absorption and oxidative stress, which further damages their developing internal organs and immune system.
So whether you look at it through the lens of biology, law, or chemistry, the act is indefensible. You're effectively destroying a person's potential before they even have a chance to reach it. The iron hat might prevent the skull from expanding, leading to intracranial pressure and cognitive impairment. The iron gloves would prevent the development of fine motor skills. It's a systematic dismantling of a human being's future.
It's a chilling reminder of how much a child's environment dictates their biological outcome. Growth isn't just something that happens automatically, it's a conversation between the body and its surroundings. When that environment is a cage of iron, the conversation ends in tragedy. Legally and ethically, there is no ambiguity. This is a severe crime against humanity.
Understanding the fragile and responsive nature of child development is the first step in protecting it. If you found this discussion on the biological and legal boundaries of child growth insightful,
The idea of forcing a child to wear iron boots or iron gloves sounds like a scene from a nightmare, yet it's a perfect metaphor for how certain societal structures physically and mentally restrict human potential. If we did that to a child's body, we'd be criminals, but when we do it to their minds through rigid ideologies or restrictive customs, the world often looks the other way. Today, we're examining whether this systemic stifling of growth is actually a form of collective crime and what mechanisms exist to stop it. It's a powerful analogy because it highlights the permanence of the damage. In developmental psychology, we talk a lot about critical periods, windows of time where the brain is incredibly plastic and ready to learn. If you've got these metaphorical iron restrictions in place during those years, you aren't just slowing growth, you're often preventing it entirely. Research from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology shows that children as young as 3 start enforcing social norms on others, using language like should and must. If the norms they're taught are designed to limit curiosity or enforce blind obedience, they don't just follow those rules, they become the enforcers of their own cage. That's a chilling thought, that the victims essentially become the guards. But it feels like this happens on a massive scale. We see it in nationalistic fervor, in religious fundamentalism, or even in deep-seated tribal traditions. People are told their identity is fixed, their questions are dangerous, and their path is already chosen. Doesn't this constitute a charge sheet against the leaders and institutions that perpetuate these lies? In a moral sense, absolutely. In a legal sense, it's more complex, but the groundwork is there. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, specifically Article 6, states that every child has the right not just to survive, but to develop to their full potential. Article 29 goes even further, saying education should be directed to the full development of the human personality, talents, and mental and physical abilities. When a state or a powerful group uses indoctrination to stop that development, to prevent a child from even imagining a different life, they are technically in violation of these international standards. If the standards are being violated, why don't we see more action at the International Court of Justice or the UN? If someone is essentially crippling the minds of millions in the name of a personality cult or a rigid creed, why isn't that treated with the same urgency as a war crime? One of the biggest hurdles is the concept of sovereignty. The International Court of Justice, for instance, primarily handles disputes between states. If a state chooses to ironclad the minds of its own citizens through its education system, it's often viewed as an internal matter. However, there's a growing legal discussion around crimes against humanity that aren't just about physical violence. The Rome Statute, which governs the International Criminal Court, includes other inhumane acts that cause great suffering or serious injury to mental or physical health. Some legal scholars argue that systemic, state-sponsored indoctrination that destroys a child's autonomy could eventually fit this definition, but we aren't quite there yet in terms of enforcement. It's interesting you mention autonomy because there's this philosophical and legal concept called the right to an open future, first proposed by Joel Feinberg. It suggests that parents and states have a duty to keep a child's options open until they're old enough to choose for themselves. But we see the opposite. Leaders are often celebrated for preserving tradition by closing those doors. They convince the victims that these chains are actually a guiding hand or a divine protection. How do you break a cycle where the victim sees the perpetrator as their savior? That's the psychological hook of these systems. They provide a sense of belonging and certainty, which the human brain craves, especially during the turbulence of adolescence. Studies in the journal Autism and Other Neuropsychological Research highlight how cognitive inflexibility, that rigid, all-or-nothing thinking, is actually linked to higher levels of anxiety and emotional distress. Yet these restrictive systems market that very rigidity as strength or moral clarity. To break it, you have to offer a more compelling value than certainty. You have to foster curiosity, which research in psychology today and frontiers in neuroscience shows is a literal life force that releases dopamine and builds more resilient brains. The antidote to the iron glove isn't just taking it off, it's teaching the person how to use their hand to explore the world. But exploration is exactly what these criminals fear. If people start asking questions, the lies about the nation's glory or the leader's infallibility fall apart. This feels like a strategic destruction of the human intellect. If we can't easily use the ICJ, what about the UN Security Council or regional courts? We've seen the European Court of Human Rights step in on cases of indoctrination in schools, haven't we? Yes, the European Court of Human Rights has been more proactive. They've adopted a prohibition of indoctrination principle in cases like Kelsen v. Denmark. They've ruled that states must ensure information is conveyed in an objective, critical, and pluralistic manner. If a school system is found to be pushing a single ideological truth at the expense of others, it can be held accountable. The problem is that many of the most restrictive regimes aren't party to these specific regional courts. On a global level, we have the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which reviews how countries are doing. They can't send anyone to jail, but they can apply immense diplomatic pressure and document the mental stunting as a human rights failure. Pressure is good, but it's slow. Meanwhile, generations are growing up with their potential permanently capped. If we look at the charge sheet again, we aren't just talking about the obvious dictators. We're talking about any system, even within democratic countries, that uses fear and isolation to keep people from growing. If a person is taught from age 5 that everyone outside their group is an enemy or lesser, is that person ever truly free?
They aren't. They're living in a state of mental custody. Research on psychological manipulation groups, or cults, often shows that even after people leave, they struggle with cognitive rigidity. Their brains have been trained to reject anything that doesn't fit the iron framework they were given. This is why international law is starting to look at freedom of thought as something more than just freedom of religion. It's the right to a mind that hasn't been deliberately tampered with or restricted. A report from the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief highlighted that while parents have a right to guide their children, that guidance must evolve with the child's evolving capacities. It shouldn't be a permanent ceiling.
So, if we want to stop these criminals, the ones putting on the iron boots, we need a two-pronged approach. We need the legal charge sheet to expand, perhaps through a new international treaty that explicitly defines the right to cognitive development. But we also need the social support for the victims. How do we get the people who've been told their leader is their savior to support action against that leader?
It starts with education that values how to think over what to think. We have to show that iron boots don't protect you, they just keep you from running. When people see that their children are more anxious, less capable, and more isolated because of these traditions, they might start to question the savior narrative. There's also a role for transitional justice, mechanisms used after a regime falls to show the public exactly how they were manipulated. Sunlight, as they say, is the best disinfectant for the lies that have been spread for centuries.
It's a long road, but reframing this as a crime against growth, as an actual assault on the human spirit, changes the stakes. It's not just a cultural difference if you're taking away someone's ability to be a full human being. We need to stop treating these iron gloves as part of a costume and start treating them as the instruments of torture they are. If we can't protect the most basic right, the right to become who we are meant to be, then all other rights are basically built on sand.
Exactly. If you stop the growth, you've already won the battle for control without ever firing a shot. That's why it's the most insidious crime of all. It's quiet, it's often invisible, and it's passed down from parent to child. International bodies like the ICJ and the UN have a responsibility to look beyond physical borders and start looking at the borders we place around the human mind. Until cognitive liberty is as protected as physical liberty, these criminals will keep operating in plain sight, hiding behind the very people they've stunted.
The metaphor of iron tools of growth, the boots, the gloves, the helmets, really does simplify the horror of what's happening. It's a systemic crime that requires a global response, whether that's through new legal frameworks at the UN or simply a global shift in how we view the sanctity of restrictive traditions versus the sanctity of human potential. If this conversation made you think differently about the invisible barriers around us, consider sharing it with someone who values the freedom of the mind.